Again, I'm Alexis with Organic Consumers Association. I'm the political director here in Washington, D.C. And tonight we are doing a webinar on raw milk with the two top advocates for raw milk in Washington, D.C., Liz Reitzig and Jonathan Emord.
Hey, Alexis.
Hey, Liz. Thanks for coming. Hi, Jonathan. So I've pulled up Jonathan Emord's bio. Jonathan Emord is one of the nation's leading free speech attorneys. He has defeated the Food and Drug Administration a remarkable 8 times in federal court, more times than any other attorney in American history, earning him the title FDA Dragon Slayer. He is the 2007 recipient of the Cancer Control Society's Humanitarian Award for winning and preserving our great civil rights to life, to liberty, and to health freedoms. He is the only non-scientist ever appointed to the Certification Board for Nutrition Specialists and serves as that organization's vice chair. In 2010, he became the first person awarded the title Honorary Nutrition Specialist by the CBNS. Congressman Ron Paul says, quote, "All freedom-loving Americans are in debt to Jonathan Emord for his courtroom victories," and calls him a hero of the health freedom revolution. Welcome, Jonathan. And we also have Liz Reitzig here. Liz, as an activist, writer, spokesperson, and the mother of 5 healthy children, Liz Reitzig has spent well over a decade working on the politics of food access in support of small farmers and those who wish to obtain food directly from them. Her work on several key cases and her proactive approach to policy and activism have helped shape national and state-level food and farming policies. She finds it vitally important that we stay engaged politically to preserve our food freedom. She is the founder of Real Food Consumer Coalition, a nonprofit dedicated to advocacy and lobbying on behalf of small farmers and the consumers who depend on them. In 2007, Liz founded Grass-Fed on the Hill, a local buying club for GMO-free and fresh farm foods, serving the greater Washington, D.C. metro area. Her work pioneering buying clubs in the region created a niche for consumers seeking direct farm fresh foods and gave Liz a unique perspective into the habits and needs of consumers as well as the challenges facing local producers. So welcome, Liz.
Thanks, Alexis. It's great to be on here and discussing this with all of you.
Awesome. So I want to show you all the website for the Real Food Consumer Coalition. So this website has all of the materials we're going to be covering today. We're not using slides in this presentation, so I urge you to write down, if you're on the phone, realfoodcc.com. And that's the best way to get involved in this campaign. So I just want to thank Liz and Jonathan for being fantastic allies to the Organic Consumers Association. Jonathan helped us out in our GMO labeling campaigns, as did Liz. And they've been terrific allies of our group, and we are so excited to share with you tonight a fantastic new strategy they have for helping consumers access raw milk. But let's just get into the topic in general first, just in case there are folks who aren't familiar with the health benefits of raw milk, why consumers seek raw milk, and what the barriers to consumer access to raw milk are. Let's start with you, Liz.
So basically, raw milk is the unpasteurized, unhomogenized milk from any of the mammals that humans typically have a domestic relationship with, and we get milk from them. So it includes cow, goat, sheep, camel, water buffalo milk, maybe a couple others in different parts of the world, but mostly here in the U.S. it's cow milk and goat milk. And a few years ago, there were some big headlines because farmers who were providing raw milk to consumers who really wanted this product were targeted and aggressively raided by the Food and Drug Administration. And this caused a lot of farmers to have to shut down or to stop serving certain consumers. And Alexis, you ask why do people want raw milk? And some of it, for some people, it is the health benefits. But what I'm finding in addition to that is people want it because it reminds them of their home. It's culturally what they grew up on. Or because they can do things in the kitchen with raw milk that they can't do with pasteurized milk. And so they want to have that culinary adventure. Some people just like the taste better. And then some people do get it for health reasons. I'm also finding that people want it more and more not to drink it raw, but to actually do home pasteurization or to bring it home and make yogurt with it or another cultured milk product. So I've found in all these years of researching it, helping people access it, that there are as many different reasons to access raw milk as there are people who want it.
Well, I want to thank you, Liz, because you made raw milk available to me here in DC, and I will be forever grateful. I think it's really improved the health of my family. Can you describe a few of the health benefits related to raw milk?
Well, sure. There's some studies out of Europe that show it helps decrease asthma in children when they have access to raw milk. And also it helps decrease allergies. Here in the US, we don't have any recent studies because of how controlled raw milk has been. We do have a lot of stories and a lot of personal experience saying that people feel better when they're drinking raw milk. They have less allergies, seasonal allergies as well as food allergies, I mean, across the board. These are real experiences that people report by the thousands. So at the very least, all of these anecdotal stories and experiences deserve some further research here in the US. And I know some doctors and researchers who desperately want to do the research, but because of the current restrictions, there's simply no opening for them to do so.
Yeah. And are there environmental benefits, benefits for animal welfare, benefits for farmers?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In all my experience in working with raw milk farmers, they care deeply for restorative agricultural practices. So they are primarily grass-based farms. And since they're smaller farms, we don't have any of the big mega dairies that are offering raw dairy, right? So they're smaller farms. They have a better relationship with their animals than some of the huge CAFOs that we find out west or a little further south. So it's something that it gives me a lot of hope that if we can turn more to the small farms who are doing the restorative practices, that we'll see a better environmental impact just from our food choices.
And turning to you, Jonathan, as a lawyer who works on First Amendment issues, who works on FDA issues, what drew you to the raw milk issue, and why is it important to you personally?
Well, I think that the primary problem that raw milk exposes is government tyranny. When you find instances in which the government singles out one particular food or one particular group for persecution, it's always of interest to me. I am a major advocate of the Bill of Rights, and I believe in limited government, and I believe in the Constitution and its intended meaning. So when I see government use a heavy hand in punishing people who are really guilty of nothing, it raises alarm bells, and I wish to combat tyranny. So that's the personal motivation. When it comes to raw milk, it's an interesting situation because there are numerous substances that people consume that are raw. People consume steak tartare, people consume oysters in the shell, people consume sushi. They consume all manner of raw foods. All raw foods are potentially contaminated, but then there's this mythology that's built around pasteurization, which only applies to milk products, and that is that pasteurized milk is safe, entirely safe. And the fact of the matter is that every year there are tens of thousands of instances of salmonella and listeria rising from pasteurized milk products that are consumed in the marketplace, and people are injured by them because of improper handling. What it boils down to really is a question of how careful are we in handling these perishable substances, whether it's sushi or it's raw milk or it's steak tartare or it's oysters in the shell. Are we taking serious the role of ensuring that these are from clean sources and that they are refrigerated promptly and kept refrigerated until consumed? Or is there more of a lackadaisical approach? So I see more commonality in foodstuffs than differences when it comes to these substances that are consumed without pasteurization. All manner of things are consumed. Peanut butter is consumed without any extraordinary effort undertaken to alter its composition, despite the fact that there are rather severe allergies, some of which can lead to anaphylactic shock and death. Yet no draconian steps, as has been taken in the case of raw milk, have been taken for peanut butter or other nut butters, despite that very real and palpable threat to public health that arises from them as well. I'm not an advocate of government controlling the food supply. I don't think that government, even if the food supply contains risks, ought to be in the business of destroying people unless they themselves are grossly negligent in the handling of the food, such that it would make it vulnerable to pathogens, or are responsible for actually putting pathogens in the food in a criminal sense. Now, when it comes to the FDA, this is a simple question of government protection of a monopoly, really. The motivation that led FDA to choose to adopt a regulation that is so draconian as to make it felonious for a party to move raw milk from one state to another, we're really doing the bidding of the large milk producers who didn't want competition. Any amount of competition from other sources affects the price of milk. And the margins are so small that if you have organic milk being sold, unpasteurized milk being sold in health food stores, for example, you're cutting into the profit that is otherwise achievable, even if it's a relatively modest supply. And so, by comparison, and so it is that they were cheerleaders in favor of the Department of Agriculture and in the states, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the United States Food and Drug Administration taking steps to restrict the ability of raw milk manufacturers and distributors from participating in the market. And, of course, it greatly enhances the market position of a party to have to force you to undergo the pasteurization process as a litmus test to enter the marketplace. So, but notice that even if you recognize the fact that there are risks attendant to milk products, which is true, it's true of every food that there's some degree of risk associated with them, that the ordinary course with risk is to disclose the risk. In other words, our legal system has generally preferred full disclosure of information and a fully informed public as a remedy to what might happen to you in ignorance. Now, despite the fact that the risk of contamination is relatively small for products that are properly handled and from clean animals, the FDA took this blanket approach of saying any party that transmits any milk interstate that is not pasteurized violates the law, and they will prosecute them. And individuals like Dan Algier and others who are in the Amish community, Mennonite communities that regularly consume raw milk, have been persecuted rather severely and singled out by the government, creating this really unfortunate scenario where something that is indispensable to their way of existence since the founding of the Republic and before is now viewed as a felony. And these people are persecuted and punished. Their livelihoods are taken from them, and they are ruined oftentimes. So that, instead of just saying why don't you tell people that there's a risk associated with raw milk, sushi, steak tartare, across the board, equal treatment to all these raw foods. Identify that there's a risk of listeria, salmonella, whatever, and then let people decide for themselves how they wish to treat it. I think it's important, and let me be cut off at any point in time, Alexis, because I'm happy to close my mouth if people get bored or turn off the station. But what has happened in the law is something peculiar here. The FDA has, when it adopts a regulation, is given broad deference by the courts when it does so for a health and safety reason. And it becomes then very difficult to challenge the law. A lot of these farmers have raised constitutional arguments in their defense based on freedom of association, for example, which is a dog of an argument, and it's lost virtually every single time. In fact, every time it has been recently raised, it's been lost. And so they confront this seemingly impenetrable legal barrier, which is as a result of the fact that over the last 50 to 60 years, the courts have developed this broad system of deference to the regulatory agencies. So this leads you to either run full speed into a brick wall, which is this precedent, in which case you just crack your head, or come up with a smarter way to deal with it, which means you burrow underneath the wall, or you find a way to catapult yourself over it to get to the other side. And that's what the RFCC came up with in this petition. We talked about the endless efforts of parties to raise these freedom of association arguments, which have failed miserably and resulted in the ruin of people, and other attempts to try to save themselves from the federal government on this rule that prohibits the interstate transmission of raw milk. And this is when I suggested, look, the rule here in question at the FDA is really an arbitrary rule. In most other instances where there is a definable risk that can be ameliorated by the action of an individual, full disclosure of that information is both necessary and sufficient in the FDA's regulatory construct. So instead of spending millions of federal dollars to prosecute each Amish farmer in the United States and all others, why not, instead of doing this great ruin to all of these communities, instead just allow a disclaimer to be placed on milk products that says, hey, look, this is raw milk. Raw milk may cause a person to suffer from salmonella, listeria, whatever. And the way to prevent that is to self-pasteurize if you want to. You can cook it on your stove at this temperature for this period of time, and voila, the pathogens will be killed. So then people have a choice actually more informed than they have in the case of raw food, other raw foods. So when you go into a restaurant, you have the misfortune of choosing steak tartare. I wouldn't recommend it. You're eating something that you don't know how long it's been sitting there. You don't know, or it's just and the same thing with oysters in the shell or with sushi. I mean, you're taking a risk every time you do that. Now, most people assume the risk because in the course of human consumption of these foods, it has been a rarity that individuals have suffered from salmonella and listeria and so on. And the same is true with raw milk. So why not instead, if the government says our interest is in ensuring that no one consumes raw milk and puts themselves at risk of listeria and salmonella, if that's the fundamental interest, how is that not best served by requiring this disclaimer I'm talking about? Because in that instance, you're reaching not only interstate circumstances, but intrastate circumstances. The current rule is arguably less effective and is both over-inclusive and under-inclusive. It's over-inclusive because there are many people out there who understand that raw milk poses these risks, and they choose to take that risk anyway, but they're informed, they know about it. And then there are many out there who may not know anything about the risks of raw milk and who may consume it and be better off despite the fact that they don't know anything about it. But they're certainly not better off in the sense that an educated consumer is presumed in both the law and in economics to be better able to protect their own self-interest. So what we're asking the government to do here, which is very difficult for the government to accept, is that state paternalism, that is the decision of the FDA commissioner to deny us all the right to choose, is not preferable. That tyranny is not preferable to fully informed consumer choice. And that's what we're arguing for. And it's a very powerful argument. Whereas an argument that raw milk needs to be available just straight without any reference to this argument I've raised, just saying we have a right to raw milk. We have a liberty right to it, or a property right to it, or somehow we are entitled to it. Well, since the 1930s, unfortunately, economic liberty in the United States has been given only rational basis protection. Only if you have a civil liberty violated is there heightened strict scrutiny. The courts have rejected the notion of criminal law being impervious to penetrate an association. An association provides no protection for you against the application of criminal laws because the courts have routinely held that a crime committed in an association is just as actionable as if it were done outside of the association. So there's no defense under the Constitution under these provisions to this argument. However, under the First Amendment to the Constitution free speech provision, the petition that we have submitted to the FDA puts the government in the position, if it denies it, of advocating suppression of a less restrictive alternative, which is allowing the information to be disseminated with the milk across interstate lines, to, in favor of this draconian approach of a blanket ban on the speech and an absolute prohibition on the product to be distributed. That's enough from me.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I do have one more legal question in terms of strategies that have been tried before to help consumers access raw milk and allow farmers to get into this market. Has a religious argument ever been made? Because apparently a lot of the farmers who produce raw milk are Amish or Mennonite, and they have a religious reason for wanting to have these small farms and have unprocessed food and directly communicate with consumers about it and sell direct to consumers.
Well, as the Supreme Court determined in the peyote case, there is no constitutional right to engage in an unlawful activity. The government has deemed interstate transport of raw milk unlawful activity. And so you don't have a right to do that even if it is part of your religion or you attempt a religious argument. So the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause of the Constitution have nothing to do with, as far as the Supreme Court is concerned, with your actions, whether there are many cases in this area that there are snake handler cases where people have said, our religion causes us to take venomous snakes and play with them, or our religion causes us to smoke peyote, or some other thing. So recognize from the government standpoint, peyote and raw milk are essentially the same, believe it or not. It's contraband in the government's view, much as that is absurd because one is a food and the other one is a toxic substance. Nonetheless, the government considers it all contraband. And the courts defer to the government's definition of contraband, largely. But so unfortunately, the religious liberty argument's not likely to make it.
All right, Liz, I'd like to go back to you to ask you about how you've run a buying club and you're organizing consumers and you're helping farmers access this market of consumers who want raw milk. How do you create standards for your buying club for like animal welfare, the integrity of the product, grass-fed, and assuming that you can do that now with your buying club on this scale, serving a local market, do we have any concerns about if raw milk were legalized and we were able to transport it across state lines and sell it in grocery stores? Do you think that there would be a need for some type of third-party monitoring of the raw milk market? We'd have seen this in organic, obviously. For one thing, Organic Consumers Association, we really liked having state-level organic standards because we thought there would be competition amongst the states, and we would get a lifting of organic standards that way. So initially, we opposed a federal standard for organic, but once there was a federal standard, we've supported the industry still, and we've just fought to keep that standard high, although it has been more difficult at the federal level. So do you see any need for something like this for raw milk? Or is there a way to keep the market small and continue to have direct sales between farmers and consumers?
Great questions, Alexis, and that's a lot all in one. So I'm gonna split it up a little bit. In terms of what I do in my buying club, it's a very personalized thing here for what I do. So I go to every single farm. I watch them. I work with them. I spend an extensive amount of time on the farms, talking to the farmers, understanding background, so I can personally say, this meat is produced in this way, or these vegetables are definitely grown without chemicals, right? I participate in the process. So that's very important to me. On a broader scale, I want to split this into two parts as well, because I want to talk about raw milk that's intended for human consumption as raw milk, and raw milk that people want to treat differently. So for raw milk that people want to drink raw, I think that it is important to have standards. It's extremely important. And I've seen what happens when there's not standards in place, and I don't like it. And there are some good organizations already working on setting up those standards and implementing them. And that is something that it's happening on a small scale right now. But I see that as the demand grows, people are not complacent in this at all. The people who want raw milk want it for various reasons, and they are willing to go to more effort. They're willing to make sure that there's some kind of organization verifying and checking on standards and actually setting appropriate standards. So there's some organizations doing that, and some quite effectively already. I'm very much an advocate of that, and I think it's a great idea. But I also think that standard setting needs to be in the hands of those organizations rather than a top-down approach from the FDA, besides the fact that the FDA is still kind of light years away from that. But there's also the fact that the petition, especially the way it's written, opens up a whole nother market. And Alexis, we've spoken about this before. We know what's happening to the dairy industry as a whole right now, and it's super scary. We are seeing farmers who, for multiple generations, they've been dairy farmers, and now they are faced with losing their farm. And there's a whole myriad of economic and market reasons that it's all the perfect storm right now for that to happen. But because of the handling instructions and the recipe for pasteurization on the petition, that it creates a whole nother market, so that people who don't want to drink raw milk, they can still go to a local farm and they can still engage directly with that farmer to get a product that they want and that they want to take home and handle appropriately. So I want to be clear that this secondary market is very important because it still gives people the choice to go directly to a farmer, even if they don't want to choose to drink it raw. And they don't want to have the same standards that a raw product requires.
Yeah, that's great. I really do feel like this is an economic issue for farmers as much as it is a consumer issue about our freedom to choose what we're going to eat and feed our family. And I think farmers deserve to be able to access this market and get the full price of their milk. I mean, that's one of the things that makes me the happiest about buying raw milk from a farmer, is knowing that they get every penny of the purchase price of that milk, and it doesn't go through a gigantic corporation that takes all the money from the farmer. Because as you mentioned, our dairy industry is in crisis, and most farmers lose money producing the food that we eat. And that just seems so terribly wrong. And so that's one of the things that really keeps me engaged in the raw milk issue, because I think that this is the best way to preserve family farms. Let's move on to the strategies here. But before we get into the Food and Drug Administration petition that Jonathan has filed on behalf of the Real Food Consumer Coalition, I'd like Liz to give us a little history of raw milk activism and the different types of strategies you've tried, both defensive strategies to protect farmers who are being targeted by the government because they're letting consumers access raw milk, and the creative things that you've done as an activist. You've got good stories to share, and I would just pick a few and share them with us.
Oh, thanks, Alexis. Well, the one thing, of course, that stands out was our milk and cookies rally at the FDA, where a group of us, mostly moms, but there were a few dads in there. We told the FDA that we would be crossing state lines with the contraband, and we asked them to please equally enforce their regulation, because at that time they were enforcing aggressively against the small farms, and they were choosing not to enforce at all against the average consumer. But the regulation didn't treat farmers and individuals any differently. It was a blanket regulation targeting anybody transporting raw milk across state lines for human consumption. So we asked them to please be fair about enforcement and come and target us if they were going to be serious about this regulation. And so we told them when we would be crossing the state lines, and we brought down, 10 or 15 minivans full of soccer moms and raw milk. And then we served milk and cookies outside of the FDA. Of course, we invited them to join us. They politely declined. And it was great. It really showed their lack of enforcement against individual consumers, which put the emphasis on the fact that this is really an economic chokehold on dairy farmers and dairy farmers who want to go direct to consumers to provide their product. They did issue a letter that day saying that they did not intend to target individual consumers. So little bits of progress, but we definitely need what's in this petition to go through to have some ease of mind, and so the farms don't keep getting raided. There's also been multiple court cases around the country where farmers are targeted, and they're isolated and targeted, and FDA working cooperatively with state health and ag departments to shut down various farming operations. And I've been involved with many of those cases, including the Vernon Hirschberger victory in Wisconsin, which was wonderful to see. They actually charged him criminally, and he was acquitted on 3 of the 4 charges and set new precedent.
Well, Liz, thank you so much for everything you've done over the years on this cause. It's really inspired me, and so I appreciate your work. I have a question from an audience member, and it's just one more question on the background of this, what's going on with raw milk. So do we treat, or does the federal government and state governments perhaps, do they treat the value-added products like cheese, sour cream, yogurt, if that's made from raw milk, is that also treated as contraband? And maybe this is a good one for Jonathan.
Yes, it is treated as contraband if it's derived from raw milk and it hasn't been pasteurized.
Crazy. All right, so now I'd like to go back to the Real Food Consumer Coalition website and let you all take a look at the site so you can see where the campaign information is. And now I want to get into the details of this legal petition to the Food and Drug Administration, asking for some relief for farmers and consumers who are engaged in the raw milk industry. So it's not, industry seems like a bad word. It doesn't fit very well with this type of farm to consumer sales. But so this is Jonathan Emord's petition on behalf of the Real Food Consumer Coalition. And let's see, let's let Liz start out, and then Jonathan, you'll give us the legal details. But Liz, why did it get to the point where it seemed like a good idea to try this legal strategy addressing the Food and Drug Administration?
Well, Alexis, we've done so many different things in the past, and I've sat with multiple farmers in court on this issue, and we really need to address it on the regulatory level at the FDA. And as Jonathan and I talked and strategized on it, he brought up a few times that there was just an executive order in saying that the president was telling all agencies to come up with fewer regulations. So we thought, well, this is a great opportunity to work this angle of it, because clearly this is a regulation that is creating lose-lose situations across the board. And by having this be one of the ones on the chopping block, it could be a win-win situation across the board. So the timing was perfect for this particular petition. Did you also say something, ask something about the other products? Or was that was an earlier question, wasn't it?
Well, I have a question here. This is Melinda from Organic Consumers, Liz and Jonathan, from our Facebook Live broadcast of the webinar. David Gumpert is watching and has a question for Jonathan. We're nearing the 1-year anniversary of the submission of the Citizen Petition. FDA is supposed to decide on a petition within 6 months. So do we have any indication of what the FDA stands on this petition yet?
The FDA has an uncanny ability to ignore those things that are inconvenient, particularly inconvenient truths. And I'm not surprised that they sent us a letter saying that they had it under review, but that due to inadequate resources at the agency, they would need to extend the time for consideration. So that's the approach that they're taking. The way to upset that approach is through congressional action. There are many members of Congress who, like former Congressman Ron Paul, take umbrage at this regulation and at the prosecution of farmers for violating it. And they are interested in pressing the agency. So when that comes to pass, and those who are listening can ask their members of Congress to support this petition by sending a letter to the FDA commissioner demanding that he act on it, sooner or later, with the pressure on the agency, we hope that there will be some action. Now, as you mentioned, the President of the United States has issued a series of executive orders and actions which demand deregulation by the agencies, and that call for the elimination of old regulations that create unnecessary burdens on the market. And in this case, it's a classic in that vein. So there is an executive order that seems directly applicable. As a result, if the agency delays much longer, what we're likely to do is to send the Office of Management and Budget a request for issuance of what's called a prompt letter, which says that the executive branch, in accordance with the executive orders of the president, want this agency to act on a petition that concerns a matter of deregulation. And if they support that, then this would trigger a requirement that FDA act on the petition. But all of this depends upon political action. So the first step is to get members of Congress interested in supporting the petition, have them demand that the commissioner act on it, and then we can increase the pressure by getting individuals in the White House, hopefully, or through the Office of Management and Budget to provide additional prodding, and then it can be raised. What will happen is the agency would then issue a decision on the merits, and then if they were to decide against us, we could then appeal it to federal district court, and then from the district court to the Court of Appeals, U.S. Court of Appeals, and then potentially to even the Supreme Court of the United States.
All right, so let's take a look at the petition now. So I'm just going to read a bit of the petition that explains what the Real Food Consumer Coalition is asking the Food and Drug Administration to do. So the petition reads, petitioner respectfully requests that the Food and Drug Administration exercise its enforcement discretion to avoid taking or to cease taking enforcement action against those who distribute unpasteurized milk and milk products in interstate commerce, when the milk products bear labels that include inconspicuous bold-faced type prominently displayed under the statement of identity for the product. 1, a warning regarding the health risks of unpasteurized milk and milk products, and, when applicable, instructions for safe handling, including self-pasteurization. So that's the gist of it. And so this could just be the FDA could take this petition and change FDA policy as a regulatory matter. We wouldn't need to have an act of Congress to change how raw milk is dealt with in this country. Yes?
That's right.
And then just another sort of side issue away from the petition, but again, to clarify for folks the status of raw milk. So the FDA can regulate the milk products in interstate commerce. And then what role do the states have? Can a state let people, drink and sell raw milk within the context of that state?
States can do that, and many states have done that. They allow, under various degrees of regulation, raw milk to be sold intrastate. FDA's jurisdiction lies in interstate commerce, so its regulations apply at the border when raw milk is moved across a border. But within the states, some states ban raw milk, other states will allow it under certain circumstances. Some states are more liberal than others. So there's actually one of the ironies of the FDA's insistence that death and destruction naturally flows from the ingestion of raw milk, aside from all of us who are panelists here who seem to have survived. But as far as the states are concerned, there's a conflict, isn't there, with those states that have liberal tolerance for raw milk and the absence of people dropping like flies is sort of a historic affirmation of the relative degree of safety of raw milk. As we discussed before, pasteurized milk has a notorious reputation for listeria, salmonella every season of the year, and particularly in the summer months, we see a spike in the number of instances of hospitalizations associated with those bacteria because of the ingestion of pasteurized milk that has not been properly handled. So as a practical matter, a lot more folks are dropping dead because of pasteurized milk not properly handled than they are from raw milk. And even though you might say on a per capita basis there is comparable, maybe slightly different degrees of risk, it just begs the ultimate question. I mean, technically we ought to include a warning if we're going to put it on raw milk of this sort. Why not put it on pasteurized milk, saying that there's a potential for listeria and salmonella or other poisoning resulting from mishandling of pasteurized milk products. Therefore, to be doubly safe, you ought to zap it again. That would level the playing field somewhat. And it would be equally justified based on the incidence, more than justified actually, based on the incidence of listeria and salmonella every year.
All right, I'm going to switch over to back to the Real Food Consumer Coalition website. And I'd like Liz to tell us a little bit about how we can get involved as individuals, members of the Organic Consumers Association Network. What can we do to help? What are the next steps? What might we be asked to do in the future? I'm sure a lot of people are excited about this new strategy. It seems like a really winnable strategy, especially in this administration. So how can we get involved?
Thanks, Alexis. Yeah, of course, the easiest thing to say is please donate. This is an ongoing campaign with ongoing expenses, and we very much appreciate any support people can provide. Additionally, going back a little bit to Alexis's previous question about what's going on in Congress, we are working in tandem here with some congressional representatives who are strong supporters, as Jonathan mentioned, of our rights to access the foods that we deem fit for our families. And so we're working with them on creating both some of that pressure on the FDA as well as companion legislation. So if you're interested in participating in a legislative push at all, please contact us through the website or through Organic Consumers Association, and we will get you involved. We can help set up meetings and walk you through the steps of contacting a representative and what to say if you're not already familiar with that. But we definitely need people from all walks of life to participate in that process, because representatives listen to their constituents. They really do. And for people to come to them and say, we want you to sign on to a letter to the FDA, that has a large impact. Or for constituents to come to them and ask them to co-sponsor a piece of legislation, that also has a great impact. So that is one of the largest areas of support that we will be reaching out to the public to ask for in the coming months.
Great. And I saw another question about how one can access raw milk. If you hear about the health benefits, you were talking about allergies and other things that are ameliorated with raw milk. How can we find raw milk anywhere in the country? Is there a good, what's your advice, Liz?
Yeah, I'll give some broad advice and then a little bit more specific. If you're looking for access to small local farms, there's a great website, 1000ecofarms.com. You can go on there and look for a provider. Now, because of the regulations around raw milk in a lot of areas, some farmers don't want to get listed. So to find reliable and credible farmers who are producing raw milk, ask another local farmer. Get to know them and ask them. There's also the Real Milk site, which gives you a list. It's a little more difficult to read because it's not based on location. It's just a list of raw milk providers. But some of them are no longer producing, or some of them don't have what they are listed because it's kind of a stagnant site. So find a local farm, talk to them, get to know them, ask them who they recommend as a raw milk source. That's my best advice. Really do the legwork. Talk to farmers, find out what's going on, and get into their world a little bit and ask who they recommend.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, Liz. If you know local farmers, you will eventually find the farmer who is producing raw milk and willing to sell it to you. So that's what we should all be doing. We should all be buying as much of our food as possible direct from farmers, so they can stay in business and keep producing the healthy food we rely on them for. So let's see if there are any other questions that have not been answered. Let's see, Melinda, help me out if you're seeing anything from Facebook that we should address.
I don't have any more from Facebook, but let's see. There was a question about, okay, you're requesting the FDA exercise enforcement discretion. Wouldn't it be better to do away with the regulation altogether? I thought this was what Trump was asking agencies to do in their review of regulations. This one can come off the books.
Yes, there is. It would be nice if they got rid of it altogether. However, at a minimum, if they exercise enforcement discretion, it would prevent it from being a problem. So what we're asking them to do here, which is interesting, we're not compelling them to get rid of the regulation, although they should, in complying with the executive order. But even if they don't, in order to avoid arbitrary and capricious agency action in light of what we're requesting, they would have to exercise enforcement discretion. The reason why we chose to use that is that this is an area where we have been very successful in getting the courts of appeal to support us, is that when an agency regulation, such as this one, is objectionable under the Administrative Procedure Act, the courts have been loath to completely eliminate the regulation, but instead have said, for example, that the particular parties in issue may not be compelled to comply because there is this, exception, and that they're advocating. So what we're asking at a minimum is the exercise of enforcement discretion, which would be consistent with the executive order, even if they would not completely remove the regulation. That would enable them also in instances where there was intentional adulteration of raw milk products. So let's say, for example, either through gross negligence or through intentionally trying to hurt people, a bad farmer were to sell a raw milk product. Well, we would not object to prosecution of those people and would allow the agency to use this regulation. But what we're saying with regard to all others who represent the overwhelming majority of raw milk manufacturers, they should be allowed to rely on this proposal that we have and avoid the application of that rule. The agency's arguments have oftentimes been slippery slope arguments. So, for example, this avoids the counter argument, which is that if you force us to get rid of this regulation, those grossly negligent and criminal individuals who adulterate the raw milk supply would get away with that. This is a built-in retort, which is, oh no, we say nothing about your power to go after parties for intentional adulteration or for gross negligence. All we're saying is that if a good party who's applying this disclaimer to their milk product sells it across interstate lines, you will not act against them on that basis. You won't act against them solely because they're transmitting it across interstate lines. There's a third reason why we choose this approach, which is that in constructing an argument to the court, they have a much more difficult time arguing against this because they, again, are disarmed of the argument that somehow we're charlatans who are trying to allow criminals to sell adulterated milk interstate. So anyway, it's very well thought out, very carefully assessed and measured approach, which is designed not to be the ultimate solution, which is basically no FDA, but to lead us towards nirvana and get us on the path towards greater freedom to move interstate raw milk products. What is likely to happen, with this is that if it were adopted, there would be raw milk transmitted interstate, and raw milk would end up being treated essentially equally with pasteurized milk, in that the FDA does not come in and force pasteurized milk parties to take direct government liability for the instances of salmonella and listeria arising from pasteurized milk products not properly handled. Why should they do the same with us? But if there is intentional adulteration or gross negligence by a pasteurized milk producer, the government should act against that party, just as they should act against a party that sells raw milk in the same unscrupulous manner by allowing it to be subject to contamination because of gross negligence or intentional, you know.
Well, fantastic. Thank you, both Jonathan and Liz, for your expertise. The hour is about wrapped up at this point, so unless there are any more burning questions, I would like to direct you all one more time to the Real Food site so that you can see how to donate to the campaign and how to contact the campaign to get involved. So at realfoodcc.com, up at the top of the page, you've got the donate button. The information about the petition is on here. And then at the bottom, there's the contact us page. So Liz will answer your communications personally if you write there. So that's the way to get in touch with the campaign. And Liz and Jonathan, thank you so much. I wish you all the best of luck, and keep us informed and let us know how we can help.
Thank you so much, Alexis.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Have a good one.